Happy New Year. That is the theme of today's show. Well, Shawn, not really. We're talking about Week 17 and what happened in NFL Week 17 that led to some of the biggest payouts in fantasy football history, some of our listeners with massive contest wins. Lots of fun to be had. A frustrating day, obviously, when you're in contests that don't go exactly the way that we would have hoped, and the prize money may not be as high as we had anticipated, but it is nice, Shawn, on that final week of the fantasy football season to have those opportunities to have that dream, I guess you can say, that things may play out in your favor, the odds may work out your way. But Week 17 is now in the books. We approach Week 18, and even as we look ahead to fantasy football playoff contests, there's a lot of people who would have been drafting teams in a certain way 24 hours before we record this that has now changed a lot with that Eagles loss to the Cardinals and then the 49ers winning. There's things that changed very significantly for those sort of contests with the buys and so on over that short space of time. So we will be talking about that in future shows. Shawn, Week 17, how are you feeling as the dust has now settled?
Good. I mean, it was a crazy year, and probably more than any other year gave us really strong reasons to internalize the fact that you want to wait more than 1 or 2 weeks to draw all your conclusions from the season. Obviously, Sunday is a real roller coaster. Many listeners will know that Ben Gretchen and I entered Sunday morning in third place in the main event, probably with a lot more reason to believe we were going to drop than rise. And yet we did still have plenty of individual pieces still to go and a non-zero chance to win the whole thing. And Colm, was funny because one of the decisions that we agonized over was the one that cost us so much last week, where Jason Sanders scored 23 points on the bench. Harrison Butker scored 2 points in the lineup. You spend the week thinking about, where you would be if you had had those 20 points. And there was a situation with, the situation with the Dolphins where really, I think, extreme potential outcomes, because you have the risk of what did happen, where they get blown out, and in the second half, they're not really in the mix to kick field goals. And on the other hand, if they stay in that game, then with the Ravens' elite defense potentially stopping them over and over in the red zone, you can get another game with 5 field goals, that type of result. Meanwhile, Harrison Butker has been cold. Having missed his 2 recent kicks, he's been cold because the Chiefs' offense is not significantly delivering him to the red zone in games. Colm, we decided to take the risk and try and get the points back and use what seemed to be a wider range with him, where the game scenario against the Bengals should probably favor the Chiefs. But, you would have thought some of these other recent games might have favored them as well. Colm, we got 26 points from Harrison Butker yesterday. Unfortunately, everything else went catastrophically wrong. So we did fall down the board. We were outside the top 30. We were headed for outside the top 50. And then Butker's 26 points pulled us back up to 30. We were in that spot by 0.4. A couple of years ago, Blair and I finished 29th, and a stat correction pushed us to 31st and cost us $1,000. We'll be hoping that a stat correction doesn't cost us again, and yet that's not really the big story here. Colm, you and I were kind of working through the numbers before the show. We had Swift and Cook and sadly Pitts. The Jalen Waddle injury really derailed our chance to win the title when he goes down early in week 16. And then, Colm, you and I, our main event team, had plenty of depth to where we were constantly trying to figure out which star to bench. Unfortunately, the team that Ben and I did not have that. We go with Kyle Pitts and get the very expected result in that he is awful. Arthur Smith is the absolute worst. If we get 50 points from those 3 guys, which again, Cook by himself, 30-ish in the first week, and Swift with a great matchup. The hard part for Cook, going in, he's got a terrible matchup against the Patriots. He's going to have to catch some passes. He drops one early. He's got a wheel route for a touchdown where Josh Allen throws the ball out of bounds. And there are a couple of plays that could have gone differently, but that's, the way every NFL week goes. For Cook to have the type of game we needed from him, he was going to have to hit those plays. He did not. The New Orleans defense does not allow you to run on them. He finishes with 16 carries for 48 yards. If we get, normal to, 75th percentile outcomes, which, Colm, if you're going to win one of these tournaments, you've got to score a lot of points. The thing that really balanced out some of this for me, and again, it's not for, any huge bragging rights or any huge prize, but our Superflex FFPC final did not go well. We were really excited because Tom scored extremely high. That was really cool. Eric also did well. We did not, but our main event team put up its highest point total of the season. We got 185 points. That pulled us into 125th. The top 150 get paid. It's also a situation where this contest is large enough that the sprint portion includes, I believe, approximately 800 of the very best teams drafted. And to finish 125th, that's cool. And that means that with the Steely and Bananas team getting 30th, with our team getting 121st, and with the flagship shows team with Dave and Curtis getting, I believe, 48th, I would just like to think that if you drafted along with us this season, that many of you did fairly well. Now, it doesn't guarantee wins in all leagues by any stretch. There's going to be plenty of variance. There's going to be plenty of luck. But it was a great way to finish off a 2023 season that had a lot of interesting puzzles and fun challenges. I'm not going to say that we met every single one of those, but Colm, I'm excited about the way this season turned out. And the last month to 6 weeks, I think, really helped any new listeners understand why we draft the way we draft.
Yeah, I think so. It kind of was, for people who drafted that way, it could have been frustrating as the season went along. But I did have a number of people, even yesterday, where it may have been very close margins in their season-long leagues and that they were, even though it was only one catch for one touchdown, they were really touting having JSN on their rosters yesterday. One listener in particular, Dave, reached out. He won 4 of his 4 championships, and I think that JSN was in a couple of those. So Dave Early, that is, I thought that was he did message back to say, I believe he lost 5 championships last year by a combined 20 points or something like that. So he thought that the luck may be going in his favor. But Shawn, it was a fun week. And, there is always, you're always the what ifs come out after, and there's always ways that your team could have been better. Even like, for example, yesterday, you're mentioning the strength of that roster we had. You cannot, in a best ball setting, that roster we had, Shawn, would have done unbelievably well, because Zay Flowers is on that bench yesterday, for example, that we don't put in. We have the Jacksonville defense on the bench with 20 points. There's lots of ways things could go better.
And Colm, to try and get the absolute perfect score.
So hard.
We went ahead and benched Sam LaPorta because we have Trey McBride in order to...
And for people that may be wondering, why did you bench Sam LaPorta? Because we've touted him all year. It was more a case that the teams ahead of us, there was more Sam LaPorta, and we're trying to, gain an edge over the field. But in reality,
we have Goff and Amon-Ra, and we were saying, partly for Goff to hit maybe the massive ceiling you need to hit on both of those guys. But we were trying to actually spread it a little bit here, where everything goes through Amon-Ra in the Saturday game, which even though LaPorta scored well, it was an Amon-Ra game. So that part worked. And then you're trying to hit on these other guys. You're trying to get both Brandon Ayuk and Rashee Rice into the lineup, because this is a CeeDee Lamb Amon-Ra team. We get both Rice and Ayuk into the lineup. Both of those guys hit, and we still have Zay Flowers on the bench. So I like what we tried. It didn't end up, quite the highest score. It only cost us, 3-4 points in there. But like you say, it's fun to have a roster where the guys in the lineup scored, the guys in the bench scored. Colm, if we were going to extend these contests out for another 3-4 weeks, I would really like our team.
Yeah, I think so. And the other part is, like, week 16, it was 119 points. We had 169 and 185 this week. It was the middle week that really, we limited the excitement heading into the week. Our goal was a top 150 finish to kind of hit that cash line. But Shawn, I'm just thinking now, as I say that, those extra 14 points the defense would have given us over the Kansas City defense. We would have been at 199 this week. So that would, the team was pretty loaded, but it just didn't get there in the end. You did mention, though, the Superflex contest. Shout out to Tom and that one. So in total, when that kicks off, there's 10,800 teams in that best ball contest. Tom finished 8th out of that. We didn't quite get into the top 8. We'll leave it at that. Our team did not turn up this week, but Eric finished 18th. So both of those guys were on the show last week. So Tom's team also from the RotoViz Overtime Listener League. So I thought that was a fun wrinkle for that. And just to give some information on the other teams, the other rosters, and how that we were estimating, Shawn, 180 to 200 would be enough to win that particular contest. The winning team had 205.54, the second team 202.44, the third team 200.94. They hit a gap then to the next team was 187.7, but every team ahead of Tom was 181 or higher. He had 170. So I felt like that, if you told me before the weekend 170, I think you're right in the mix. But to have 3 teams over 200 points, with 50,000 to first and then it tailing off pretty quick, 10,000 to second, I did feel bad for teams at the second and third team because 200 points is a monster score any week in Superflex.
I mean, Eric had hit 220.
Yeah.
I really thought that I did think more sort of what Eric was saying, where I thought it was going to maybe take 220. But if you had told me in a contest where Christian McCaffrey is scoring that many points and more than half of the teams have him, 29 of the 50 teams that had him, and he goes out and doesn't have a big game, that it would still take the number that it took and the 3 teams would go over 200. Because one of the things here is that you have McCaffrey, who's on 29 teams, not have a great game. Certainly not a game where you'd even want him in the lineup if you're competing for that top prize. And you have a situation where Amari Cooper, who got so many of the teams through, doesn't play. He's on a huge number of teams. For those 2 guys not to score in a way that mattered and to still have 3 teams above 200, it gives you a sense, again, of how it does help to have a lot of healthy players, because we had some strange names go off. Darius Slayton gets a long touchdown in the Giants game. Obviously, we had lots of Wandale teams, Colm, and he has a big game for the Giants yesterday. So we were hypothesizing that some of our deep players would hit and help us win. They didn't, but deep players did hit in week 17, and that was a big part of the story.
Yeah, when you look at the players who did, I was messaging Shawn, some of the things that we would like to work in our favor that would help give us a bigger chance of winning. But you mentioned Christian McCaffrey. So obviously he was 58% owned in this contest, but he doesn't have the day you would expect him to have, entering based on his average performance. But the likes of Jahmyr Gibbs was the joint third most rostered running back at 20%, a lower day for him. Obviously on Saturday, Rashad White didn't have the day that he has been kind of having over time. Mayfield got points late, but he was 34% owned in this contest. You mentioned Amari Cooper. He missed out obviously with injury. Mike Evans, Adam Thielen, lower days. 4th highest rostered wide receiver in this was Olave. Then you had Jordan Addison. All of those guys, no big days across the board. Sam LaPorta, who really, that last drive was where he picked up his points, but Cole Kmet came in with question marks around him for would he be active, wouldn't he be active? He was active, but finished today with no reception, so he was 22% owned. Lots of players, Shawn, who were heavily rostered. Even Derrick Henry at 16% was inactive. Sorry, Hunter Henry rather than Derrick Henry. But it was interesting the way it played out because there was lots of things that fell in our favor, but then the players that we had also did not really do much to activate into a successful lineup. But you mentioned Darius Slayton. He is actually in that winning lineup for the Road Warriors team, 20.6 points for him. The winning team was Lamar Jackson, Etienne, Khalil Herbert, Slayton, CeeDee Lamb, David Njoku, Isaiah Likely, and then George Pickens. Shawn, I have to mention here, though, CeeDee Lamb. What an immense performance in championship week. We always have these players who, and I'll put Lamar Jackson actually into that for people who had him, 36.34 points in this particular Superflex contest. But CeeDee Lamb, 41.2. We come into the season, and even at early in the season, saying that, this guy just needs a minimum of 10 targets every single game. You have to give them to him. It doesn't matter what the game script is. But CeeDee Lamb has elevated himself into the tier with Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. And I know Jamar Chase, it'll have been frustrating towards the end of the season with, no Joe Burrow, and the season was a kind of frustrating in general, even with Burrow in there. But CeeDee Lamb, 227 yards, 13 receptions, 1 touchdown, one of those being that 92-yard reception And then he obviously had 1 fumble, but he had 5 yards rushing as well. But CeeDee Lamb is just like, we're about to see him ascend into the peak of his career here over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and we did some shows on Stealing Bananas where we touted him as potentially being the top receiver, being in that tier with Justin Jefferson. Colm, I know that you passed along, plenty of YouTube comments suggesting we were getting, way too far ahead of ourselves.
Far too far ahead of ourselves. Not far enough, I think, Shawn.
Yeah, and I think it gives, again, a good understanding of how it is helpful to be forward-looking and not always looking back and not always purely drafting players after they've proven whatever it is that you want them to prove, because then the price has shifted to a point where it no longer helps you.
It's baked in. The success is baked in at those prices.
Exactly. So our team in the main event with Amon-Ra and CeeDee Lamb, and then some of the big-time running backs coming back with those other receivers that we mentioned, with an Ayuk, with the Flowers, with a Rice. Really loved that setup for 2023. I'm excited to see whether or not that same approach will work again in 2024, how much the community reacts and closes some of those loopholes. But CeeDee Lamb, it's another great example of the way that different players are going to progress in their careers at slightly different rates, and that he was a little bit slower to achieve absolute stardom is not an indication that it's impossible for him to do. And we say that a little bit slower. And one of the reasons we talked so much about JSN this summer, and it didn't play out, and I want to make sure I emphasize that. But the reason that you have enthusiasm for guys who come in with really unique profiles, you look back at CeeDee Lamb, and over the second half of his rookie season, coming into a team where Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup had just come off of 1,000-yard receiving seasons, Lamb was the guy who, and it was just by fractions of a point, who was the leader over the second half of the season in fantasy scoring. And, in part because of that, in part because of how he struggled with the Raiders, in part because of how he struggled at the end of his tenure with the Cowboys, in part of how he struggled over the first half of the season. I'm always a little bit skeptical of where drafters are taking Amari Cooper in contemporary drafts, because we have enough red flags for him. And yet just last week's performance again illustrates that Amari Cooper at many points in time is that guy that he was in his first 2 years with the Raiders, is the guy he was at his peak with the Cowboys, and is the guy he was in week 16. For CeeDee Lamb to have immediately come in and trumped him, again, is an impressive sign. So a number of things there, but also I think Mike McCarthy deserves a ton of credit. And I mean, you think about the offseason narratives and how they can shape ADP, the prices that we get, the certainty that we have. And I know I've mentioned this on the show before, but it's such an important point with how week 17 developed and how CeeDee Lamb was the guy who determined everything. That, again, just mentioned this article from Matt Irby, who wrote 3 articles in season for us, did just magnificent work. His debut article for RotoViz talked about McCarthy and the things that he specifically brings to the table for reality and fantasy, and how this situation was going to be a lot better than most people were anticipating. And Colm, I mean, a lot of what we're doing when we draft CeeDee Lamb at the 1-2 turn is simply saying, we feel like this guy has the potential to become a star and his floor is very high. So either way, it's going to be a solid pick. And if you hit, then it's a league winning pick. It's potentially a tournament winning pick. That was always the case, but certainly Matt's article and reading through the excellent evidence that he presented in that was part of how comfortable I felt loading up on Lamb as we really headed into these most important drafts. So I want to mention that again. If we have listeners out there, we've had obviously people on the show. Eric has filled in for us when I was gone. Matt is someone who is from the RotoViz community and had reached out to me on certain things. And we had a nice discussion, and he ends up writing all of these fantastic articles. If you're part of the RotoViz community and you are interested in writing for the site, reach out to Colm, reach out to Dave Cabin through our normal RotoViz email and let us know. It doesn't always work out. It's not always the perfect fit. But I mean, so many of our readers and listeners have gone on to either become big names in the field, which that's not necessarily the thing that I, try and emphasize or think that we should be looking at. But so many people who fit that label have gone on to really enjoy interacting with the writers, writing really cool stuff themselves, having an outlet to take their enjoyment of fantasy football to the next level. If you fit that and you've been looking to get involved, definitely reach out to us as we start Colm with a 2024 campaign that is going to be even better. We'll call him CeeDee, as you mentioned, an absolute star. He is going to be in contention for the 101. I mentioned it to Ben when we were doing our projection show. I do prefer CeeDee Lamb to Tyreek Hill for 2024.
And I think that's a good place to have. I said he was with the other two, but obviously Hill's had a massive season, and then we'll see how it plays out through the playoffs. But, the narrative, as you mentioned, can be driven through that. But I think that's probably going to be the split point for most people. But the age profile, which we'll obviously be talking about, will continue to be in CeeDee Lamb's favor there, as both guys, Shawn, as you know, will both continue to age at the same speed over the course of the offseason. You mentioned people getting in touch. That email, rotovizradio@gmail.com, if you do want to reach out. Some other players, Shawn, some listeners reached out, and I mentioned sometimes, you get up and you're like, well, that's the season kind of basically over at this point. And I wake up and I have multiple DMs, multiple people have sent tweets to say, thank you to a combination of people, but usually it's the ship chasing crew. Ben, you're not on Twitter at @FF_contrarian. Shawn did get some tags on Twitter for these messages, but getting messages to say that thank you for the advice throughout the season, or that they have gone on to win contests, like I mentioned with Dave earlier. But some people that did reach out, Shawn, major prizes won. Eric reached out, the Superflex Chihuahua. He was involved in that, came second, won $15,000 with a Lamar Jackson team over there. Breece Hall sprinkled in. But the player that I wanted to mention here, you mentioned Ayuk. Ayuk's in that roster. Zay Flowers in that roster. Davante Adams is on that roster, Shawn. And Adams is somebody who we've talked about over the years. And it's no secret, I don't think, that I'm a massive Davante Adams fan. But somebody who we hadn't been on this year. And again, the age of the player, the situation, and Las Vegas, but it hadn't really been going great the last couple of weeks. But he comes up in the championship round. When you're thinking about players who make a difference, 13 receptions, 126, and 2 touchdowns in a game which against the Colts, wasn't going to get my excitement levels up if it wasn't fantasy football related. But he came through in a major way, particularly here in this situation for Eric. But Adams showing again, as you mentioned with Cooper, that sometimes this talent, when it does get to be on full display and the quarterback is giving them a chance to make the plays, epic talents.
Colm, another player who showed up big in week 17, one of our permanent favorites, DJ Moore, 9 catches, 159 yards, a touchdown in the snow that Taylor Heineke goes 10 for 29 in, throws 3 picks, that Drake London goes 4 for 56, that Van Jefferson outdoes Bijan Robinson and Kyle Pitts. In the snow, DJ Moore, uncoverable, catches 9 of his 13 passes. Colm, Justin Fields to DJ Moore is for real. The Chicago Bears are for real. It's too bad that they blew a couple of those games that they had won. I mean, just completely won. They'd be 9-7 instead of 7-9, and they would be one of the biggest stories heading into the postseason. This resurgent coaching staff, the breakout for Justin Fields, DJ Moore reestablished, if anyone had any questions, as a superstar, the running game getting going now. They apparently have had some issues with Deontay Foreman, but Khalil Herbert reminding people why he was one of the players on the original Zero RB candidates countdown because of the numbers that he has put up. I mean, Herbert has had extraordinary peripherals in his short NFL career. And then we also got plenty of contribution from Roschon Johnson in this one. Johnson showing off at the goal line, getting a touchdown, also catching 3 targets for 38 yards. That hybrid profile for him that has been stepped on a bit with Justin Fields doing what he does, where he both, runs and when he passes is pushing the ball frequently to DJ Moore. But even with those things working against him, even being in this 3-way split, Roschon Johnson, someone who is pushing himself out there as a very intriguing pick for 2024. Certainly someone who, unless his stock really rises, is going to be on the candidates countdown again next year. He was on this year. The Chicago Bears look very, very good. The Atlanta Falcons, after an impressive win last week, completely fall on their faces. I think this has to be the last straw for Arthur Smith. I don't see how anybody could watch this game and think that he can get, another game. I would fire him today. But Colm, Justin Fields, he was our guy. He was our quarterback in the Superflex final. He showed up. Nobody else did. But the Chicago Bears would appear to have a very bright future, especially when you consider how much draft capital they have amassed to add to their squad in the offseason.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things there. I think, there's questions around what they would do with the first pick now. Obviously, that's locked in. The Panthers would have had it, but they had traded it away to the Bears. A lot of conversations around, getting a quarterback there. What Justin Fields is showing, especially when DJ Moore has been healthy, that is the way to go, I think, moving forward here. So we'll see what they do. Connor Shawn also reached out. Connor Farrell, second place in the little eliminator. Now, don't let the little part of that, throw you off. $50,000 in prize money to second place in that. He also mentioned, though, Chris Godwin had a 2-point conversion that was originally given in that game. He did step out of bounds and come back in just before he made that reception. It was turned over, and they were unsuccessful with the next attempt. But Shawn, he 1.2 points approximately out of first. That would have put him into first for that one. So that would have been tough. That was for 100K, but shout out to Connor, a massive win, $50,000 over there on Underdog for him. And the last one, Shawn, we're going to mention, who will be jumping on with us for a show this week, and that is the Achievers. We are here on RotoViz Radio. We'll leave out the first the word of the name, but awesome to see him get in there. 12,500 over in the Chihuahua final, 3rd place finish. And Shawn, we have to mention this because unfortunately for him, Jaden Reed was the reason that he was not able to hold on to a 1st or 2nd place, bypassed by both of those teams. But Jaden Reed, 26.9 points before leaving that game with an injury. And I think we have to give a shout out to Jordan Love, because there's quite a few of his teams that finished well in the finals here. But I joked with you off air that, the Packers, the defensive struggles they were having, and, that offensively they were doing quite well with the young pieces they had. And then I even said to you that Jordan Love is out here throwing passes to Bo Melton. And I was like, Bo Melton. You're like, well, you were talking about Bo Melton's profile coming in. But Shawn, this week, 22.5 fantasy points for Bo Melton. What, are we in a situation here where it's similar to CJ Stroud, where it's is Jordan Love making these players, or are these players actually talented as we approach our draft prospects for 2024 here, when we're thinking about where players should go by ADP? What are we doing with the Packers wide receivers, or is it just Jordan Love?
Matt LaFleur deserves an incredible amount of credit for what your Packers have accomplished. Jordan Love has been fantastic, and the coach has designed an offense around his skills as opposed to the other way around. And he's taken things that he does, right? I mean, he is part of this Shanahan tree where they're the coaching staffs who have had answers in 2023, but LaFleur's willingness, ability to design it, the things that they do in the games, how they run the play calls, how they deploy those receivers. You contrast what they've done with all these no-name receivers with what Kansas City has struggled to do, and it becomes more impressive because that is not easy to do this season. So a lot of credit to them. You mentioned 2-point conversions. That's a pretty sore subject for Lions fans.
Tell me,
again, we're having some real trouble with the NFL officials, but congratulations to Dan Campbell and the Lions, who probably deserve to be the 2 seed in the NFC. They're not going to be that. But Colm, such a fun week 17. fantastic 2023. We'll leave it there for today, but we're going to have so much more content in 2024 that I think listeners will love. So we can't wait to get back with you.
Yeah, definitely. And Shawn, we won't get into them, but some players that do deserve a shout out. You mentioned with CeeDee Lamb, and I think his production has been more to the fore than the player I'm going to mention, but David Njoku, somebody who felt like, there was hype, nothing happened, got that contract. I thought the contract shouldn't have been given to him, but over the last couple of, maybe it's Joe Flacco. Is Joe Flacco the new CJ Stroud? Is that what we're trying to say? But these guys, particularly, obviously Amari Cooper, but David Njoku really flashing ahead of next season's draft time. But Kyron Williams gets the job done, 30.1 fantasy points. Pacheco, Shawn, 29.5 in a game where you mentioned Bucker earlier. It was the two of those guys that really pushed them to victory. James Conner deserves a shout out for his 26 points. Jerome Ford, 26. Shawn, one play that helped us in the main event, but I was thinking when it happened, I'm like, maybe this would be better for ADP if it didn't happen, was Travis Etienne scampering to the end zone. But yeah, the other one final play to mention, Devon Achane getting up at the back of the end zone for that receiving touchdown. I'm sure his managers would have enjoyed that in week 17. But that is going to do it for this rapid, short New Year's Day recorded episode of RotoViz OT. Thank you for joining in and listening along. We will be back with another show later in the week. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. And until we are back, have a good one.